is Barbara Barrigan-Perea with Delta Flows, a radio show by the Voice of Stockton and Restore the Delta. This is the weekly radio show where we discuss everything Delta related: the environment, water management, water quality, farming, history and culture, public events, recreation, Delta food, and the arts. Tune in to Delta Flows on KXVS, the Voice of Stockton, streaming live on Facebook and YouTube at KXVS Radio.
KXVS, the Voice of Stockton, live. The Voice of Stockton at Stone Soup Studio. KXVS.org.
The views and opinions expressed in the following program do not necessarily reflect those of KXVS, the Voice of Stockton, or its parents, affiliates, management, and staff.
KXVS, the Voice of Stockton. It's time for Connections, Peace and Justice Radio with your host, Bruce Giudici.
Good evening, and tonight we are going to be discussing this Peace and Justice Network Connections Radio. We talk about local issues, and tonight we're going to be talking with Cleveland School Remembers folks, also folks who are working on the Brady campaign to prevent gun violence, the local chapter. With us are Sharon Jarvis, who is a board member, Julie Schardt, who is a co-chair of the organization, and Niki Smith, who is also a co-chair of the organization. So welcome.
Thank you.
So I'm wondering if you, one of you, can volunteer and say what Cleveland School Remembers is. Maybe we could discuss, how the organization came to be, and start with that.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll start with how we started.
Yes.
We're Cleveland School Remembers because we're a group that got together when the Sandy Hook School shooting happened. Mm-hmm. We were teachers.
And that was when?
That was in December of 2012. It was just 5 years ago in December. And there were about 5 of us who were teachers at Cleveland Elementary School, and were retired from there. And you might remember that Cleveland Elementary School had a schoolyard massacre on January 17th of 1989.
Right.
So that was something that had been on our minds for a long time.
And Cleveland School is in downtown.
Cleveland School is
mid-school Stockton.
It's
Midtown Stockton.
Midtown Stockton. It's here in Stockton. It's been a Stockton school since 1954, I believe. Mm-hmm. A neighborhood school, and in January of 1989, a gunman came onto our school campus, onto the playground, and brought an assault weapon and shot and killed 5 of our students, wounded 30 others, as well as a teacher. So that
these were children who were...
These were young
ages?
children. These were primary age children. The children who were killed were first and second grade. Mm-hmm. It was during the primary lunchtime. Kindergarten children were in the cafeteria having their lunch. The 4th through 6th graders were in class waiting for their turn to have lunch. So our children were on the playground for their post-lunch break. It happened a little bit after 11:30 in the morning. Right. And this individual set his car on fire with some explosives as kind of a distraction, went through the fence after having probably cased the area previously, because he knew when the kids were going to be out there. Sure. And so he used his weapon. I don't know exactly how many shots were fired, but there were hundreds of rounds. And as a result, 5 children were killed, and the others were wounded.
And these are predominantly Southeast Asian children.
Yes, and that's apparently why he targeted the school. He had been a student there briefly when he was probably in 5th or 6th grade, but he knew it was a school that was predominantly Southeast Asian, and because he had a fixation about Southeast Asians. This was just after the Vietnam War. I don't know that he served in the military or anything, but that was his purpose, was to kill as many Southeast Asian children as he could. Yeah. But there were, among the 30 children who were wounded, there were most of the children who were killed were Cambodian Americans. There was one Vietnamese American who was killed. But on the playground, there were Hispanic kids, African American kids, Caucasian kids, all all first through third graders at the school.
Yeah, actually, I happened to be substitute teaching over at Hazelton School on that same day, and I remember that school was locked down at the same. It was like this massive.
Because
because people didn't know what was happening.
Yeah,
it was quite.
Well, it's interesting because those of us who were teachers at the time. We were focused on our students and what had happened at our school, but the first thing I thought of after that was my own children who were at Stockton. One of them was at Hazelton at the time, and 2 at other schools, and that's what you think of. You as a teacher, you're focused on your students there, but then as a parent, you think, is this something that's happening on a broader area? So it's a complicated, complex thing that happens.
And so when Sandy Hook happened, that brought the teachers that were at the Cleveland School shooting together to because they thought something needs to be done. Here we are
again,
2014,
and again keeps happening.
And it keeps happening, and now it seems to be escalating even more. Now we see what happened in Las Vegas, and we see what happened in Orlando, and we see what happened on and on and on.
And the regrettable thing is that people seem to treat it as if it's some sort of natural disaster, like it's something that inevitably is going to happen.
Well, but if it were a natural disaster, we'd be looking to do something about it.
Indeed.
FEMA would not, but some organization would be coming here to say, what can we do about this? But it's maybe looking at it as something, but it's just something that happens to society. But we, as an organization, have worked for a long time looking at what can be done about it. And there are some things that can be done that aren't being done.
So you're Cleveland School remembers, but there's also a Brady campaign to prevent gun violence, and there's chapters all over the country that are working towards dealing with gun violence.
Mm-hmm. Brady is a national organization, and the Brady organization was started when James Brady, who was the press secretary for Ronald Reagan, was shot. And then after that, he and his wife, because he was unable to go back to that job, he and his wife started the Brady campaign and started working back before 1994 on gun violence issues.
There was a Brady bill.
There was a Brady bill, and then the National Brady campaign is still very active now. And so, we were Cleveland School Remembers first, but then we got in touch with the Brady organization, and they were supportive of everything we did. And so we made our association with them formal about a year ago. So we are a Brady campaign chapter now.
Wonderful. So, it seems that, we're seeing more and more gun violence, that nobody seems to know what to do about. I mean, is there something, Sharon?
Well, we certainly have some ideas of things that should be done about it. And it's very widely accepted in our country by a large percentage of the voters that we should have background checks, mandatory background checks on all gun purchases. And that does not seem to be at all controversial until you get to Congress.
Right.
And certain gun groups have an awful lot of influence and an awful lot of money. And so despite the overwhelming popularity of having background checks with the American people, it is not happening on a federal level the way it should. We have strong gun laws in California compared to many states, and I think that's exactly because of what happened at Cleveland Elementary School, because that was the first schoolyard shooting in the 20th century. I mean, it was unusual when it happened.
It was shocking.
And unfortunately, that has changed so that it's not unusual. Yes, I remember, I lived in Sacramento at the time of the Cleveland Elementary School shooting, and my children were all in elementary school. And of course, like Julie said, as a parent, it could have happened in Sacramento. It could have happened at the school where my children were that had a heavy Asian population. It didn't, but it could have.
Yeah. And so the amount of money that goes into primary campaigns really is what shifts the whole debate, because a lot of people who would be for some sort of background checks, or even some sort of some of the legislation that's passed in California in terms of having to show identification for buying ammunition, or having to go through gun dealers, or any one of those issues, those things get stopped right away because people who would essentially Republicans who would stick their necks out on this issue would probably be defeated in a primary.
Yeah, on the federal level.
On the federal level, and then what happens is that because the districts are so gerrymandered, those Republicans, whoever they might be, however extreme they might be, are guaranteed to win in the general election. And so that's why in this election, in this 2010, this election coming up right now, is the time to start thinking about how those districts are drawn. California is different than most states in terms of the way that the districts are drawn, but still nationwide, that whole gerrymandering process is what has, and I would think a lot of people would agree, has what's stopped reasonable gun legislation from happening in the national level.
Well, and there is some progress being made in some other states. I know Pennsylvania, for one. There have been a couple of states that things have been put forth and then fought against, but courts are ruling in favor of at least looking at the redistricting, and we know that our former president, Obama, is working on that along with Eric Holder, I believe, so we're hopeful. But you're right. There's a lot of money that comes from, like Sharon said, comes from the firearms organizations, that the NRA, which is a huge lobbying group, the Gun Owners of America, and because the gun manufacturers see this as a way to keep their product going. And we know that one of the buzzwords, or the buzz phrase that keeps coming up, is Second Amendment. And what's happened is the meaning of that amendment has been turned and skewed by the gun lobby, and so those people who are, I won't say every gun owner, because most of the gun owners and most of the members of the NRA are supportive of strong background checks, but they use that, and that's how the NRA is
scare tactic.
It is a scare tactic
that people like our organization want to take your gun away, and what we advocate is common sense gun laws, not taking people's guns away, but we don't think the mentally ill or domestic violence abusers should have guns. We think that guns that are in people's homes should be locked up, and they should use trigger locks and have them locked away and the ammunition in a separate place, because we're worried about children. All the time you read about children getting somebody's gun and killing a playmate, or the little girl who took her gun, somebody's gun, in her backpack to school the other day, and it went off when she put her backpack down.
Oh my God.
I mean, these are just ridiculous scenarios.
That's another one of the goals for the Brady campaign, is to change folks' attitudes regarding if a gun makes you safer in your household. At this time, 63% of Americans think that having a gun in your house makes your household safer, which it doesn't. Like Sharon was saying, you're more likely to have a suicide happen in your house, domestic violence issues occur when there's a gun in the house, or accidental shootings, unintentional shootings happen when there's a gun in the household. So we're trying to change those attitudes for the Americans out there. And we also have another goal, is to find the bad apple gun dealers, and a bad apple gun dealer is a gun dealer that will sell weapons to those folks that shouldn't have guns. Right. So straw purchases is what they're called, when somebody brings a friend in, to buy a gun when you're not supposed to be able to buy a weapon.
Right. This is Peace and Justice Network Connections. We're talking with Cleveland School Members Board members Sharon Jarvis, Julie Schardt, and Niki Smith. And, when I was growing up, I grew up in a hunting family. And we have, I have more rifles than, I should, that I would ever need. Deer rifles, shotguns, 410s, some 22s, but no handguns, because handguns really aren't useful for anything hunting wise. But when I grew up, my dad took us hunting, and we went deer hunting and rabbit hunting and stuff. And after after a while, it just seemed I was never really all that much into the shooting of animals, but also the people who we would go with we would go up to a deer club, and there was a group of folks who would get around, and they'd be like these old. I'm from an Italian family, and the old Italians would get together and hunt, and so but as I got older, the folks who were members of that deer club, the outlook changed. It wasn't so much a sporting thing. It became more of a killing thing. It was just more of a attitude. It seemed that there was more of a militarization of the idea of hunting. It was more I don't know. It became I don't know if you could say it, more violent. And people thought of and they sort of went along with the way that the NRA changed. The NRA used to be more of a gun safety organization, and little by little it became more of this Second Amendment. I have a right to have as many guns next to my bed as I possibly can, and that group sort of changed as well. And my dad ended up quitting the NRA because it sort of had veered so far off. And I'm wondering, I know that the NRA has they're supported by a lot of gun money, because there's
gun manufacturer
money. And so I'm wondering if there's any sort of attempt to try to tag those profits that those companies obviously make off of the fear. Like, say, when Obama came into office, it was just like guns were flying off the racks.
Gun sales went up, and they went down with this administration too.
Yeah, and then in terms of ammunition, I'd always thought that the thing is that you can have as many guns as you want, but just get rid of the ammunition.
Take care of a lot of the problems.
Well, yeah. And so, is there any attempt to try to? I think California, didn't they? Wasn't there something about ammunition, about how? I don't know if it's something how much you can buy, but
background checks are required now for purchase of ammunition. So people who can't have in California. I'm referencing California because we do have among the strongest gun laws.
Yeah.
So,
So what recently passed in California?
Well, Proposition, was it 56? It was the initiative that Gavin Newsom put forth that had 6 components, a couple of which had been addressed before, but it did have to do with a background check on ammunition and several other areas of background checks on guns and reporting lost or stolen guns within a certain time, which it seems strange to me that anybody would object to that if a gun is stolen, you should report that to the police department instead of just thinking, oh, well, it's gone, because that helps them keep a record of guns that are missing and keep an eye out for them.
Well, there was a local mayor who had a problem with losing a gun.
That's true.
And didn't report it.
Yeah.
And then that gun ended up being used in a violent crime.
Yes, yeah.
Right.
That also happens with law enforcement are allowed to keep their weapons, and we tried to put forth laws requiring them to secure their weapons within a vehicle, but there's a lot of pushback from a lot of people because they feel that it's an interference of their rights. But another aspect of that is with every law that's passed in California, and they're very carefully constructed, and the Department of Justice looks at them, scientists look at them, but then every time a law is passed, then the gun industry looks at a way to try to get around it. For example, you might have heard of the bullet button, which allows you to use ammunition from your gun for a quick release. When initially what they were trying to do is keep people from being able to use massive amounts of ammunition at in one effort.
Well, there's those bump stocks that if you pull the trigger and then the recoil from the one shot ends up having you pull the trigger again for a semi-automatic machine, so it ends up being an automatic weapon. Right. And immediately after the Las Vegas shooting, which I guess the guy used this sort of deal, that device went off the market for like maybe a month or two, and then because of course right after that tragedy, or not really a tragedy, but it was predictable. Right after that incident, that was not the time for Congress to take up any sort of gun control measures or to deal with that issue. Obviously, as soon as something happens, when those 9/11 jets hit those buildings,
towers.
Within a week, the Patriot Act was signed by Bush, which restricted a lot of people's rights. I mean, that was immediate. There was no problem in trying to figure.
But more recently, it's been said, this is a time to mourn, not a time to act.
Yes.
Well, I think we can act while we're mourning.
Indeed.
We don't have to be paralyzed from action.
Indeed. Yeah. So, because the thing is as soon as the heat was off and nothing happened. The bump stocks went back on the market, and I don't know if they're still selling as well as they ever have, but it just repeats itself all the time. I mean,
well, and once something goes off, they find a clever way to work around it and to produce another accessory for a gun that will do the same thing.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, automatic weapons have been illegal since Al Capone days. And you don't see a lot of people, going around advocating, machine guns.
You don't see a lot of deer hunters out there with automatic weapons.
Indeed.
Either, do you?
No, you don't.
My
No.
father and family, his growing up was like your family. They all hunted.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you gave the animal, it would seem a sporting chance, although those rifles are pretty damn accurate, and they're pretty high powered, but still, you weren't, just mowing them down like it was war.
And people would eat what they killed.
Yeah,
they would eat the rabbits. They would eat the squirrels. They would eat the deer.
Yeah,
it wasn't just, let's mark this up as a trophy.
Yeah, sort of like in the Buffalo days, or
it's incredible what the NRA tries to do to even our own legislation that we've already passed in California. They're trying to get it so that anyone with a concealed weapon will be able to come to California. That's the latest law that they're trying to.
They want to have it universal, that if in your state you can carry a concealed weapon with or without a permit.
Right.
Than any other state you can go into with that.
Advocating are states' rights activists and advocates, but they don't see this as a states' rights issue. So
that's interesting.
Right. And they also want to legalize firearm silencers, and law enforcement is against that, and a lot of law enforcement is also against the Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act. But those bills are still out there. And they did pull back with one of the I can't remember, after Las Vegas they pulled back a little bit, but then the bills stay out there. And you don't know when those bills are going to come up for a vote.
Right.
You can anticipate or hope that they're going to put out the word, but they can do it tomorrow morning.
Right. Right. And, the closer to election you get. I mean, there's a lot of legislation that does, as it gets, the legislation that is going to benefit people becomes less and less likely to pass as you get closer to an election day. But the legislation that is going to benefit big moneyed interests becomes more and more likely to pass, or at least to get a vote before an election, because then people can point to it and say, look at me, I voted for the gun lobby, so, NRA,
give me some more money.
Give me some more money. That's right.
It can be very frustrating, but it's not stopping us.
Yeah.
We just push back a little bit harder.
A lot of what we're trying to do is educate.
Right.
And so at various I'm at a loss for words. I'm just so distressed. Various public events, which are either health events or children and family events, our group will try and present information at tables to educate families about guns and what they can do if they have a gun in the home to protect their child, and also the ASK program, which talks about, if I have this right, when your child is going to somebody's house to play, it's okay. In fact, you should ask the parents if there are any guns in that house, and if there are, what they do to keep them out of the hands of children. Because who among us would want our child to go and play at somebody's house, and because we were embarrassed to ask that question, have them not come home?
Indeed, yeah. And that's something, that I would, I never thought of that when my children were growing up. I never thought of it either. At all.
Never.
At all. This is Peace and Justice Connections with Sharon Jarvis, Julie Schardt, and Niki Smith. We're talking about Cleveland School Remembers and the Brady campaign to prevent gun violence. The website for Cleveland School Remembers is just as it sounds, clevelandschoolremembers.org. And Facebook page is Cleveland School Remembers. And you can contact them at the info at their website. And so you can get all sorts of more information. You guys had an art show like last summer or last spring?
Yes, we had 3 art against violence exhibits over a series of years. Started out in the beginning at the Mexican Heritage Center. Okay. And then I was involved, not that year, but the subsequent 2 years, I was kind of the leader of the art exhibits, and we had hundreds of adults and students who participated in our art against violence exhibits. And we also, at the last 2, had an afternoon of music and dance, which Niki was in charge of, and a spoken word event. And
a panel.
That's right. The panel discussion that often was led by Joy Neese, who's one of your broadcasters. That's right. And we found it to be a very effective way to get information out and to get our art community thinking about violence and gun violence.
Yeah, and this was down at the fairgrounds, right?
The last 2 years, it was at the fairgrounds. Yeah, and it was a very good venue, and the fairgrounds were very good to us.
Yeah, well, in Stockton, it's hard to ignore gun violence. It happens more than we would ever want to see. I live up in Valley Springs, and people, I say I love Stockton. It's a great place, but people up there are terrified to come down here because they see the police log in Calaveras County is just an amazing. It's an amazing joke. I mean, you have a suspicious person looking at a goat or something. I mean, it's just like, and then that is called into the police. But here, when you look at the police log in Stockton Record, it's much more grim. So, in terms of initiatives that the city of Stockton is doing, do you know of anything that the Mayor Tubbs or that the new administration is working on to try to lessen gun violence?
Can I say a couple of things about that first?
Sure.
I know that it can be pretty scary to look at the police log, but Stockton is not the police log. Yeah. There's a lot more going on here.
I love
you know
Stockton.
that, but I want the people who might be listening or watching to understand that there's a lot that goes on here. Yeah. Another thing I wanted to say is we do have issues of gun violence, and our mayor, among the many things he's doing to improve the public safety of Stockton, he's put forth the Advanced Peace Initiative, which we supported. We wrote a letter in support of it after looking at it for a couple of years. Sharon brought it up at one of our meetings a couple of years ago. She'd been reading about this same program happening in Richmond and the success that it had, and we feel really good about bringing the program here, and we think it's going to make a difference.
And we find it very amazing that our mayor has gone out and gotten millions of dollars in grants. There is no city or taxpayer money being spent on this advanced piece. It's set up as kind of a fellowship to target the people who the police know. There's a handful of people that are responsible for most of the gun activity, whether they can be arrested or not. And the program finds those people, matches them up with mentors, tries to have somebody working with them every day to get them into jobs, to get them into other activities. And after 6 months, if that person has been successful in doing those things, then they start to get a small stipend, like you might if you had a fellowship at a college, and that stipend can increase based upon what that person is doing. But it appears to have been extremely successful in Richmond, and Sacramento is doing the same program, but they're doing it with taxpayer dollars, and we're not.
Yeah. Well, a local newspaper, which she'll be named, Connections, we ran a nice cover article on Advanced Peace. And it's, when you read into what this program does and what the results are, and nothing in education is ever 100% foolproof. But for folks to focus on the part of this, the one controversial part where people are actually getting paid $1,000 a month.
That's the absolute maximum anyone would ever get.
The whole it sort of throws out the entire process before you get to that point. That the process is the important thing. The payoff at the end is is a reward for good behavior. But what we're doing now in terms of punishing bad behavior seems to be not working. I mean, bad behavior should be punished, but still there should be some idea of working with people to get them through their situations so that we can have a more peaceful society here.
And to give them some alternatives and to have them see a wider world beyond their gang or their small group, even beyond our city.
Yeah. So it's.
But we do also have a very good relationship with the police department and with Chief Jones, and we do believe working, that it's very beneficial to work with our local law enforcement agencies.
Yeah. Because there recently, Black Lives Matter and the concern about excessive police violence. I'm sure if we had reasonable controls on handguns in particular, I would think that police wouldn't be so quick to be afraid for their lives. That everybody has a gun, because it's so easy to get a gun, it would seem.
Well, no other industrialized country in the world has as many guns and as many problems as we do with guns.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of money to be made. I mean, I was pointing out that before the show, there's an article in the current Connections. It doesn't really talk about local gun production, but it talks about the whole concept of exporting guns to guns and weapons and missiles, and the military industry of our economy. That a lot of our export earnings are based on weapons exports. That we're the biggest weapons exports country in the world. That we produce these weapons and we export them to countries that really can't maybe don't have stable enough governments to be able to absorb them, or just I guess feel that they need them to suppress their own populations. But this country is sort of built on a I don't know if it's a foundation of weapons manufacture, but it certainly is a very strong part of our industry.
Well, and I think we all remember our Republican president, Eisenhower. Warned, a famous and great general during World War II, and he warned against the military-industrial complex.
That's right.
And boy, was he right.
Yeah. So so how do we turn this stuff around? How do we get people to start thinking about guns being less safe or being more a danger than a safety item?
Education.
That's the question.
Yeah. It's a focus of the Brady organization, and a lot of it is getting not just the statistics of gun violence, but the stories. We're trying to focus on the stories of individual people who have been impacted by gun violence, of families, individuals like us, the mothers downtown who've lost their children to gun violence. But also another thing I was going to mention, I know you live in the foothills. One of the main problems with guns is the high suicide rate. About 60% of gun deaths are suicides, and most of those suicides are white men, 50 and over. And I know that
maybe
that's
veterans?
Veterans, and I know we have a friend who lives in Nevada County, and she said that's what they're focusing on right now. They have they've lost a couple of community members to suicide, and so that's become a rallying point for them. But the problem with suicide is you don't always hear about it. But it's a huge issue. So I mentioned the foothills because I know there are a lot of veterans who live up there, and we know some of the issues that they face. But as far as getting the word out, we have lots of statistics, but people kind of cloud over when we start to talk about statistics. So we think it's important. It's the human stories, just to tell people. And we know that we can't change everybody's mind, but with our outreach, trying to educate the public, especially parents, about gun safety in the home, we just try to keep at it.
Right. Yeah, because there's just so many. There are so many families that have so many guns in their and I think what they believe is that if they have a gun in their household, that they're going to be more safe.
They do, but statistically, that is not proven to be true. But, as Julie says, you throw statistics at people and they just seem to think their situation is different. Right. So if you have the real life story of the teenager who was shot coming in after hours through the window when he wasn't supposed to, or she wasn't supposed to be out, or the person who takes a gun and commits suicide on an impulse, who wouldn't have done it the next day, if that gun hadn't been there. Suicide with a gun is pretty deadly usually, unlike other methods.
Suicides, you don't get a second chance, and 80% of people who survive a suicide attempt don't attempt it again, and with a gun you don't get another chance. Other ways you might have a better chance. So it's a real problem.
It is a real problem. So again, when I'm growing up, I'm around rifles all the time. But still, some of my relatives, my cousin and brother, and they have handguns, and I just don't understand the use of a handgun. I just don't understand how what the only use for a handgun is to kill something very close in close quarters, and I guess it comes to the idea that. I don't know if it's mostly men or I guess more and more women now. But where they feel like they're in control of the situation if they have a gun, and that they can somehow overpower somebody with that, and if they have control over the gun.
Well, and I think a lot of people enjoy target shooting also, and we're not trying to stop that kind of thing. We just want common sense gun knowledge and safety.
Yeah, and the recent, even coming down to the recent environmental law where they banned lead in bullets, and to preserve condors, and that was primarily the reason was to keep condors from, because they eat the dead animals, they accumulate lead and die. So. But still, there's all sorts of environmental accumulations of lead that isn't just condors. There's other scavenging animals and stuff. But after that passed, I'm not certain. I don't know if it got repealed or what. But it was definitely a talking point at the deer club that I go to. That here's this overreaching government telling me what sort of bullets I'm going to use, and the thing is that a lot of these guys have like boxes and boxes and boxes of bullets that are now not going to be useful anymore, that they couldn't use them, and so even something as small as an environmental sacrifice to keep wildlife alive is pitched as being some sort of taking, some sort of not being able to exercise the right.
Well, and whereas really, I think your traditional hunters who especially grew up in rural areas, they were very appreciative of the environment that they lived in and of the animals. I mean, I remember my dad, he used to love and go sit in the duck blind and watch the ducks work, He enjoyed that as much as he did bringing home a duck to eat. Yeah. And so I think our focus perhaps has changed, as you mentioned, Bruce, with hunting. Maybe it's not the same approach.
Yeah. It's Peace and Justice Connections. I'm here with Sharon Jarvis, Julie Schardt, and Niki Smith. We're talking about guns and gun violence. Cleveland School Remembers. If you want to learn more about Cleveland School Remembers, it's the website is clevelandschoolremembers.org. Facebook page, Cleveland School Remembers. And so when you're talking with people, when like you're tabling or you're at the art thing, what sort of response do you get? Do you get people who come up to you who already agree with you, or do you get people who are arguing with you in your face and getting upset about how they're gonna, how you're trying to keep them from being able to shoot things?
I think we get both sides. Yes. Yeah? We get a lot of people will come to the table and they, because of the name Cleveland School Remembers, talk about that event.
Yes.
So a lot of people let us know, oh yes, this is where I was when that happened. And then of course we do get the folks that are, the Second Amendment, they're all about that. And
But it gives us an opportunity to talk to them.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't want to just talk to the people who agree with us.
Yeah.
It's helpful to get the dialogue going, whether people agree with you or not, so that they don't just think we're rabid about what we're doing. And we do have also other events that we do. In particular, I think we wanted to tell people the fourth Tuesday of every month. We are out at the corner of March and Pacific, and we demonstrate for an hour just with signs and about
the signs that are...
Yes, like the signs that are here about our concern about gun violence in our society. And if there's something currently before Congress, we might have signs that have a phone number for people to call. But we would like to invite anyone to come out and join us the fourth Tuesday at 4 o'clock on the corner of March and Pacific. We are just trying to educate people and get the word out about what we're doing here in Stockton.
Right. So, I'm one man and 3 women. Do you think, and I don't mean to be sexist about this at all, but do you think that this issue is something that that can be? I mean, I know it should appeal to both sexes, but this is an issue that women are taking the lead on, and that that there can be a more resonance with women than with guys.
Well, the Brady group was formed by James Brady and his wife, and he was a conservative Republican who worked for Ronald Reagan.
Although I would guess before he was shot, he would not have advocated a Brady bill.
I have no idea.
We don't know that. I don't think so. But that's what happens to a lot of people when gun violence touches them closely.
Yes.
That's when they wake up and they become aware and understand that it can happen any place,
when it's your
anytime.
friend or your child or you.
Exactly. But you've heard of Moms Demand Action, which is it's an organization that also works on gun violence prevention, and Moms Demand Action was part of Everytown. Mike Bloomberg started Mayors Against Gun Violence several years ago. We got our mayor at the time to sign on to be a part of that, and then he's using a lot of his money to fight gun violence, and that organization became Everytown. and Moms Demand Action kind of came out of that, and it's an organization. Just what it sounds like. It's Moms Demanding Action after Sandy Hook happened, and we're finding that our groups have a lot in common. Their outreach is a little bit different, but it's encouraging to see that it's not just the Brady organization, that it's not just Moms Demand Action, but there are other organizations.
Well, also, Black Lives Matter for that. I mean, for that matter.
Yeah.
I mean, you have that's. I mean, it's not only gun violence, but a lot of the violence that Black Lives Matter is discussing
where that's come out of, and at a lot of our events we have largely mothers who have lost their children partly to that issue as well, who come out and want to hear more about what we have to say. But there are many organizations, and I think people have an ear for it. But like you said a while back, that there's money that backs the NRA, there's the gun lobby, and when there's a lot of money that goes toward the candidates, they might not listen to their constituents. They might listen to the base of their constituents, but they might not listen to what it is that we're advocating. But we can't give up. We only hope that the Congress will look a little bit different in a few months.
Yeah, I think the stories are really important. The statistics are one thing, because numbers are. I mean, I work in statistics. That's my job, but they're definitely not as. And in connections, I think, I'll put in all these numbers, and they'll just be so obvious to people. When you add up all the dollars that are wasted on this military boondoggle or whatever, just saw that there's $800 million that they can't figure out how they spent last year. $800 million. I mean, that's like that's like 10. What? That's $108 million nonprofits, and I've worked for probably $108 million nonprofits. But that's how much they can't even account for.
Yeah.
It's just, but when you look at that, you say, that's just a number. But when you're talking about somebody's life, you talk about somebody's child.
Yeah.
Who's shot in their arms, or it becomes personal. People understand it.
You brought up money, and it is also an economic issue. When you look at the families impacted by gun violence, whether or not, when somebody's killed or somebody's wounded, the long road back to recovery, what it costs the public, the police department, law enforcement to do, examine these incidents and see, all the research that they have to do to find out who did it, get their evidence, find out where the gun came from. It's a really expensive proposition. The other thing I wanted to say about money is that gun violence is a public health issue. I mean, it's pretty obvious, right? So many of the over 30,000 people a year are killed by gun violence. And several years ago, the Centers for Disease Control were the extra funding for gun violence research was taken away from them. So they had to work within the budget they had to do research on gun violence, which really limited them. Yeah. Partly as a result of that, UC Davis, you might have heard of Garen Wintemuth, has started the Office of Gun Violence Research. And what he's going to do, what that group is going to do, is take a look at the incidents, take a look at the statistics from whether it's domestic violence or all these other things. He's going to be able to access the numbers and tell a story about gun violence, so that we can look at ways to mitigate.
Yeah, because that's been suppressed for so long by
it has,
NRA,
but
right. We talk about these dollars, and then people are critical of the advanced peace process, which is like pennies on the dollar in terms of like what you're talking about, just in terms of investigating and following up on, not to mention the grief of the family.
Yeah.
I mean, in terms of the gun violence. I mean, if we can save 10, 15 lives out there on an annual basis, it would pay itself off in tenfold. So it's the whole. I think that the people. I don't know if they just like to judge people, or think that folks who get into certain situations are they have to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and they have to do it on their own. But in this case here, for this advanced peace, I think if the community comes together and can support these folks, I think it's going to be a win-win for everybody.
we hope so.
Yeah.
I think it will be.
How can it be a loss?
Yeah.
It's not costing us any money. it can only add to the programs that we are trying in this city and county.
That's right.
And when you think about where the money came from, it's being grant funded by several organizations, one of which is the Hope and Heal Fund, and a few others. But the Hope and Heal Fund is an organization that they've gotten their money from moneyed people who are not just going to put their money into an organization that's going to do something without any kind of research or background, but that organization was started specifically to look into gun violence and ways to mitigate gun violence. And the fact that those people who are accustomed to taking their big hunks of money and supporting various efforts, the fact that they looked at this effort and they've looked at Stockton and they want to support it in Stockton, I think says a lot, as well as those other organizations. So we have a lot to learn from this effort, but I don't see how we, like Sharon said, how can you lose?
Yeah, and you know, when it does prove itself, I would just be, encouraging government to use their resources to invest in this sort of public safety rather than just throwing another policeman or two onto the streets. I mean, a lot of times people look at public safety and think that, well, what we have to hire 50 more policemen. But really, a lot of times if you work with people and educate people, education is probably the strongest deterrent that we have. And so, of course, teachers.
Well, and this program will also help our police officers.
Yes, right.
I mean, they have a huge job.
Yeah.
And this is not something that's going to impede them.
No,
it's going to assist them.
Exactly. Well, excellent. Well, okay. Well, I think we're about out of time here, but anyway, this has been Peace and Justice Connect. You have some final words?
Oh, no, there's always more words to say. We're just really grateful for this opportunity, and we hope that people who listen to this program will contact us and find out what they can do, because even one person can make one phone call, or one person can come out and hold a rally sign, and we need the public to come together to help with this effort.
And
if you just go to our website, there are many, there are interesting articles there. There's interesting information there. We're not going to track you down if you just look at our site. And if you find something there you're interested in, we'd love to have you get involved with us.
Or if they prefer, they can also make a donation to our organization, because we are funded by ourselves.
And how can they do that?
There is a PayPal.
There is. They can do
button
it
that they can do through the website.
Okay.
And if they don't want to do it that way, we'll take it in cash. We'll take it in a check. There are addresses there,
but not goats or sheep. So do you have do you have monthly meetings?
Yes, our board does.
Yes, we meet every month at one of our members' house.
Okay.
And you can find that information on our website.
On the website. And then also you guys gather with signs on the corner of Pacific and March. When?
The fourth Tuesday of every month.
What time?
4 o'clock.
4 o'clock. 4 to 5?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Until the clock changes, and then until the time changes, then we move to 4:30.
Okay, cool.
And if it's a hot day, we bring water.
There you go. And wonderful.
And then we have a related group called Draw It Out, which works with art to look at gun violence and to get children and other people thinking about what they'd like to change in their community. And if there are artists and other people like that in the community, we've got a place for you too.
And so how can they connect with that?
Well, that's also on the
website?
Cleveland School Remembers website and on the Facebook page.
Okay.
There's actually a separate tab on there for Draw It Out, which is part of Cleveland School Remembers, but it's an art component.
Wonderful. Well, great. Well, thank you so much for coming by. Sharon Jarvis, Julie Schardt, and Niki Smith. This is Bruce Giudici with Peace and Justice Connections Radio. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce.